Okay, I'm back with you now, and I have the MOTEN and the TORRES cases, and we'll just go over these cases very briefly to illustrate the principles of today's discussion related to accuracy in permanent impairment ratings. And in one of these cases, we're going to find that the trier of fact, which this case went all the way to appeal, in other words, it went beyond the workers' compensation judge, it went to appeal. The trier of fact found that both the permanent impairment rating under the strict application of the guides and the alternative impairment rating under Almarez and Guzman, both of those impairment ratings were overinflated, and neither of those opinions qualified as substantial medical evidence. And in the second case, the trier of fact ruled against and opined against the alternative impairment rating under Almarez and Guzman, again, opining that the opinion was not substantial medical evidence. So I love the concept of substantial medical evidence because when you can provide an opinion or conclusion that is substantial medical evidence, that's an opinion and conclusion that's upheld. It's upheld by the trier of fact. Why is it upheld? Because it's a substantial opinion. It's an opinion that's likely true. It's accurate. It's correct, because it's successfully passed through the filters. It's supported by facts. It's supported by reasons. It's supported by an adequate examination. It's supported by an adequate history. It's actually the true and accurate and correct determination. And how can you find any fault with that? That's what we're after as qualified medical evaluators, isn't it? Aren't we after opinions and conclusions that are true? Aren't we after opinions and conclusions that are accurate? Aren't we after opinions and conclusions that are correct? It seems that California is trailing the nation in the frequency with which cases go on to settle with a permanent disability award because largely of overstated and overinflated opinions and conclusions by the qualified medical evaluator. And let me give you a couple of examples of cases that got stuck, that did get caught, and that got rebuked by the trier of fact. The first one is the MOTEN case. Now, with the MOTEN case, the work comp judge, the judge found in pertinent part that the applicant sustained injury to her back and left hip, as was entitled to an award of 19% permanent disability, 19%. For back and left hip. 19%, that's kind of high. Would you agree? 19% is a lot. That indicates some serious impact on activities of daily living, 19%, correct? Well, the defendant contended that the finding of 19% permanent disability was not based on substantial medical evidence because the rating incorrectly applied the AMA guides to the evaluation of permanent impairment. In other words, they're saying that the qualified medical evaluator did not use the AMA guides correctly. And by the way, this one involved an AME. This one involved an AME. So the AME, who are chosen apparently because of their expertness, did not apply the AMA guides correctly. Well, so the defendant had a problem with it. Well, the applicant had a problem with it as well. And the applicant contended that the work comp judge improperly rejected an Almarez Guzman opinion by the AME, and also because the work comp judge incorrectly rated the applicant's nerve impairment. There was apparently some involvement of the peripheral nerves in the lower extremity. So here's some facts. The AME assigned 2% whole person impairment to the applicant's low back solely as a pain rating, 2% whole person impairment to applicant's left hip based on loss of range of motion, 1% whole person impairment to left thigh muscle atrophy, and 1% whole person impairment for pain of apparently of the hip or the lower extremity. So under the strict application of the AMA guides, we have 6%, 2% for the low back for pain, 2% for Lost range of motion, that's 4. 1% for atrophy. 1% for lower extremity pain. Well, I find a problem with that already in that the agreed medical evaluator assigned 2% whole person impairment to the lower back solely as a pain rating. This is in violation of the AMA guides in Chapter 18, where they tell us that the examinee will not qualify for a pain-related impairment, PRI, pain-related impairment, in the absence of a conventional impairment rating, a CIR. So a pain-related impairment only accompanies a conventional impairment rating. A pain-related impairment does not stand alone in the absence of a conventional impairment rating. And this is described in the AMA guides. This comes from the AMA guides themselves, where it says on page 573, this is the steps for evaluating pain-related impairment. Step A, evaluate the individual according to the body or organ rating system and determine an impairment percentage. Determine first an impairment percentage. So in providing a pain-related impairment for the lower back, the agreed medical evaluator does not provide an impairment rating according to Chapter 15 related to the lower back. So that is in violation of Chapter 18 principles. So the 6% whole person impairment rating is likely overinstated. It's overinflated, not properly based upon a strict application of the AMA guides, and that's what the defendant objected to. Well, so then the parties deposed the agreed medical evaluator, and you know the intention of the applicant attorney at deposition was to get the agreed medical evaluator to take a look at the impairment rating using an Almarez Guzman approach to obtain a better result. Well, for some reason, the agreed medical evaluator tried to comply and tried to provide an alternative impairment rating by testifying that the applicant, in his opinion, had lost 20% of the function of her lumbar spine. Thus, he changed his impairment rating of the lumbar spine from 2% due to pain to 20%. So the agreed medical evaluator, on the urging of the applicant attorney, increased the lumbar spine impairment by tenfold. He multiplied it by 10. Somehow, the examinee went from 2% impairment with no conventional impairment rating to 20% impaired due to 20% loss of function of the lumbar spine. Well, the next question at deposition, of course, is, well, doctor, explain to us how the examinee, in your opinion, has lost 20% function of the lumbar spine. Here the parties are asking for the pertinent facts. They're asking for the doctor to qualify his opinion as substantial medical evidence. And he says, and this is a quote, he says, well, number one, if you look at the actual MRI, she does have degenerative changes. Does that explain why the examinee or how the examinee has lost 20% function of the lumbar spine, the fact that she has degenerative changes? No, that doesn't answer it, does it? Well, he continues. He says, she has bulges. Some are rated as mild bulges, and some are minimal bulges. I'd have to go back and read it, but he says, and I think that Dr. Kim, when he saw her, he felt that the work restrictions were, no sitting, prolonged standing, lifting 20 and then 25 pounds, respectively. I think that kind of would be a preclusion. Well, let me just go to the first report, he says. So I think when we look at her ability to function, I think that 20% loss, I think, is reasonable. So that's why I think the 20% for the regional impairment is reasonable. And here we're confronted with an opinion wherein the doctor himself cannot substantiate his opinion for 20% loss of function of the lumbar spine. He provides some gibberish language, none of which are pertinent facts to support a 20% loss of function. And the reason, in my opinion, why the doctor cannot provide support for his opinion on 20% loss of function is because it's not true. It's not actual. It's not correct. If it was correct, there would be reasons to support the opinion. So let's go to the bottom line. The agreed medical evaluator assigned 4% whole person impairment due to peripheral nerve impairment to the femoral and lateral femoral cutaneous nerves. And then he opined that despite all that stuff for the nerves, despite all the loss of range of motion, the atrophy, all that stuff under the strict impairment rating, he opined that the 20% rating for the lower back, based on the 20% loss of function of the lumbar spine, was the most accurate rating. So the workers' comp judge, he instructed the rater to issue a rating based upon the initial findings for pain, loss of range of motion, atrophy, and pain in the lower extremity, plus the addition of a peripheral nerve rating, and he instructed the rater to ignore the alternative impairment rating under Almarez and Guzman. So the workers' comp judge was not impressed with the Almarez and Guzman rating, and he deferred instead to the strict rating under the AMA guides. But the defendant had problems even with this, finding that the agreed medical evaluator did not properly use the AMA guides. So this went to appeal, and on appeal, here is the conclusion. As detailed below, both the AME's, the agreed medical evaluators, strict AMA guides rating and his Almarez Guzman rating are defective and do not constitute substantial medical evidence. And they talk about why the AME's rating was not substantial medical evidence. He improperly combined impairments due to atrophy and loss of range of motion. He improperly combined atrophy with peripheral nerve rating, and he did not even do the peripheral nerve rating correctly. They state here that it was error to combine applicant's muscle atrophy and peripheral nerve injury into the same rating under a strict AMA guides approach. So even under the strict application of the AMA guides, the AME overrated, overstated, and inflated the permanent impairment rating. The AME never completed a proper analysis of applicant's peripheral nerve injury. The evaluator must first assign a classification of the severity of the motor deficit using Table 16.1. Then the evaluator must assign a percentage of sensory deficit using Table 16.10. Then the evaluator must multiply the percent of motor deficit and sensory deficit against the maximum value. Here, the AME never assigned a percentage. He never multiplied the severity. He did not combine the results. The AME's opinion on peripheral nerve impairment is not substantial evidence. So in this case, they found that the AME's permanent impairment rating under the strict application of the AMA guides and also under Almarez and Guzman, neither one of those were substantial. And it was the defendant's position that they weren't substantial because they weren't accurate. They weren't actual. They weren't based on an adequate examination, and the AME was simply trying to achieve a better result. It's possible, in my opinion, it's possible that this examinee possibly could have qualified for 0% impairment rating due to no limitations with activities of daily living, no activities of daily living deficits. Okay, and then finally, let's review our final case, which is the TORRES case. Here, under Almarez and Guzman, the agreed medical evaluator makes an analogy for lumbar spine injury to hernia under Chapter 6 and also due to gait disorder under Chapter 13, he then takes those analogous and alternative ratings and adds them rather than combines them, and substantially increases the permanent impairment rating compared to the strict application of the AMA guides, but the judge found that the opinion was not substantial. So the defendant seeks reconsideration of the findings and award issued by the workers' compensation judge. The judge found that the applicant sustained an admitted injury to the lower back, to the psyche, and also in the form of erectile dysfunction while employed as a vineyard worker. The work comp judge further found that the injury caused 50% permanent disability. So we can tell already that the agreed medical evaluator opined for erectile dysfunction, which we determined earlier is a completely subjective statement by the examinee. The defendant contends that the work comp judge erred in finding 50% disability. The defendant argues that the work comp judge should not have relied on the report of the panel qualified medical evaluator because his opinion does not comply with the requirements of Almarez and Guzman and is not substantial medical evidence. Okay? So in this case, the qualified medical evaluator opined for 8% whole person impairment for lumbar spine injury based on a DRE lumbar category 2. Now we know that a DRE lumbar category 2 qualifies for 5 to 8% whole person impairment, 5 to 8, with 8% impairment reserved for those examinees who have a severe impact on their activities of daily living. Well, he provided for 8% whole person impairment due to applicants, quote, reports pain-related insomnia, which is subjective, limited tolerance to positioning, which is subjective, and some sexual dysfunction because of the back and pelvic pain, which is 3 subjective limitations to activities of daily living, which I suspect are probably not limited at all, in which case the examinee would qualify only for 5% whole person impairment. Well, in a supplemental report, perhaps trying to please the parties, the qualified medical evaluator offered an alternative rating under Almarez and Guzman, where he effectively quadruples or quintuples the permanent impairment rating by analogy to hernia under Chapter 6 and to gait derangement under Chapter 13. He says Table 6.9 on page 136 of the guides provides rating criteria for frequent discomfort precluding heavy lifting but not hampering some activities of daily living. Is that a true statement? Yeah, that's a true statement. Table 6.9 does that, doesn't it? He says this table refers to loss of lifting capacity due to abdominal herniation. Is that true? Yes, that's true, isn't it? It's a true statement. He says there is no abdominal herniation in this case. Is that a true statement? Yes, that's true. There was no abdominal herniation in this case. He says, but class 2 in the table applies by analogy. And here he's going to try and support the application of this table in this case. He says that classification allows a 10 to 19% range of impairment of the whole person. Is that a true statement? That's a true statement. The table provides for 10 to 19%. And then he says, clinical judgment places the level of impairment at the upper end of the range since there is multi-level degenerative disc and facet disease. And that's his whole reason for analogizing to hernia and for providing for the highest impairment rating in the range. He says clinical judgment. He doesn't say my clinical judgment. He doesn't own the clinical judgment. He says clinical judgment. Clinical judgment places the level of impairment at the upper end of the range since there is multi-level degenerative disc and facet disease. How in the world does multi-level degenerative disc and facet disease qualify for the highest value within the range due to abdominal herniation and preclusion from heavy lifting? He doesn't explain it, see? He says the whole person impairment is 19% by analogy. And then, using the same philosophy for gait derangement, he refers to Table 1315. He says this classification allows rating for alteration of station and gait due to cortical, spinal, or central involvement, and that's all true. He says there's no central involvement or cortical spinal disruption in this case, but Class 1 allows 1 to 9% range of impairment of the whole person. That's true. The individual rises to a standing position, walks, but has difficulty with elevations, grades, stairs, deep chairs, and long distances. He doesn't say that this examinee has those problems. Then he says clinical judgment places the level of impairment at the upper end of the range, or 9%, since there is multi-level involvement and radicular pain from the lower back, and that is not a reason that supports an analogy to gait disruption, and it's not a reason that supports the higher number within the range. And then he goes on to compound matters even worse, and he says the impairments for loss of lifting capacity under Chapter 6 and alteration of station and gait are additive, not combining, they're additive for 28% whole person by analogy. So the Qualified Medical Evaluator goes from 5 or 8% under the strict application of the guides to 28%, which is a quadrupling or a quintupling, but he can't actually support it with a substantial opinion because he doesn't actually believe it to be true, because he has no pertinent facts upon which it's based. And I suspect that even the 5% whole person impairment rating probably overstated and is probably inflated, and this individual probably has no limitations to activities of daily living beyond the subjective complaints of insomnia, limited tolerance to positioning, and some sexual dysfunction because of back and pelvic pain. And the appeals board stated that the Qualified Medical Evaluator did not qualify his opinion as substantial medical evidence, and they rejected the impairment rating. Also, the doctor failed to explain why he added the 19% and 9% impairments to produce an overall whole person impairment of 28%, rather than combining them using the combined values chart. For these reasons, the doctor's opinion is not substantial medical evidence. So doctors, let's wrap this up. In providing for permanent impairment ratings, there's a couple of important principles. Most examinees do not have true limitations to activities of daily living. You'll determine this if you do an assessment in the face-to-face evaluation with your examinee. So most examinees have an accurate impairment rating of 0%. Other examinees that have a permanent impairment generally qualify for permanent impairment according to the strict application of the AMA guides. When you provide your impairment rating, it must pass through the filters of substantial medical evidence, and higher inflated impairment ratings get caught up and clogged in the filters of substantial medical evidence and cannot be supported. So I'm encouraging you to look for the accurate impairment rating that applies to your examinee and provide that impairment rating to your examinee. For examinees whose impairment is more accurately described by the Almarez and Guzman alternative ratings, that alternative rating will be correct, will be the most accurate rating when it passes through the filters of substantial medical evidence. If it cannot pass through those filters of substantial medical evidence, it's obviously an impairment rating that's not accurate and that's not correct. So doctors, I hope this helps you with your very next evaluation. All anyone in the system wants is for accuracy, is for what's actual, is for what's correct. And these are some principles in providing for permanent impairment ratings that you can rely on with your next 100 evaluations. So I want to thank you for taking the time to join me on today's discussion, and I look forward to being with you on our next discussion as well as we conclude our current series entitled The QME's Financial Impact. For now, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I'm wishing you best of success in your career as a qualified medical evaluator.